Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this presentation. It's a jointly organized presentation by the Leakey Foundation, San Francisco, and the local Chicago Council on Science and Technology, known as C2ST. And I've been asked to say a few words about those two organizations and how this lecture came to be this evening. My name is Bob Martin, and I'm an emeritus curator at the Field Museum. And in 2001, when I moved to Chicago to join the Field Museum, one of the first things I did was to make contact with the Leakey Foundation because I knew of its history in promoting research into human evolution. And one of the really important things they do is to provide grants, seed money, to get new investigations going. And over the years, they played a tremendous role in many of the studies that have yielded the information we have to hand today. But the other thing that I then learned is that the Leakey Foundation had established Leakey lectures, which were held in various places in San Francisco and also in other cities. And so I was hoping that one day we could get Leakey lectures to Chicago. And I met up with Cheryl Camisa, who is the managing director of the Leakey Foundation in Chicago. And we sat down and hatched the idea of having 2 Leakey lectures a year at the Field Museum. We managed to set that up, and it ran very successfully for a decade. But unfortunately, after I retired, the series was discontinued at the Field Museum. And I was quite worried for a while that the series would not continue. But Cheryl kept on the board, and so did other people, and luckily it came to pass that this series was restarted. So there was an initial lecture last year, and this is the second in the series. And you know, I kick myself for not having thought of the partner, C2ST. This is a very young organization, about a decade old, and I was at the Field Museum when it started. And I've never seen an organization take off so quickly and become so successful. And they organize numerous events around the year. And one of the things they're doing right now is aiming to participate in the March for Science, which will take place in Chicago, as in many other places. And it never occurred to me to suggest a marriage between C2ST and the Leakey Foundation, but somebody else suggested that, and that was how the first lecture came to be last year. And I'm very much hoping that this series will grow and flourish, and that there will be a regular series of presentations, because the topic of human evolution is really, really important and fundamental. It's not properly taught in schools. It's very little opportunity to get any personal exposure, and so lectures like this are really very important. So I wish this series well, and I'm honored to have been associated with it, and I look forward to many more here in Chicago. And tonight we have a particularly accomplished and excellent speaker to talk about a topic that's dear to my own heart, which is Paleolithic cave art. But I will say no more, because Chet Kamen, who is a trustee of the Leakey Foundation, is going to present the speaker. So I'll hand over to Chet.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming in. Also a trustee of our host tonight, Columbia College Chicago. So a round of applause for Columbia for hosting this wonderful event. So Meg Conkey, who I met for the first time at lunch today, I think you'll just be thrilled. She is I can hardly see her. A wonderful speaker and a wonderful human being, and she makes real this art and social forms that existed 15, 20,000 years ago, and I think we're all in for a treat. Meg is from University of California at Berkeley, where she's now a Professor Emerita. She's taught there for over 30 years, teaching about prehistoric art. She received a bachelor's degree in art history from Mount Holyoke and master's and Ph.D. degrees from the University of Chicago Department of Anthropology. And I think a number of people from Chicago are here tonight, and a number of her old friends. Meg's written many books and articles about Paleolithic art, but what's particularly exciting to me about her background and qualifications for you is that she actually goes out in the field and gets her hands dirty, digging things up and finding them, and then once she finds them, evaluating them and interpreting them and trying to make meaningful the context in which these things occurred. And there was a particular, I guess we got the new development director of Columbia College tonight. I have to make a plug for Columbia. Our central mission is to inspire students to create the culture of their time. And I like to think that that's really what these artists were doing 15 and 20,000 years ago. And Meg's going to talk to us about that. She is a past president of the Society of American Archaeology, which last year awarded her the Lifetime Achievement Award. She's also led, and I'm going to read this so I don't get it wrong, the Archaeology Division of the Association for Feminist Anthropology section of the American Anthropological Association, which sounds like a lot of verbiage, but it's a very important organization, and her role in this is very important. And later this year, she will receive the Huxley Medal from the Royal Anthropological Society. So on behalf of the Leakey Foundation and C2ST, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Meg Conkey.
Are you turning can everybody hear me? I have a microphone on my back. I'm sort of a robot today. Anyway, an android or something like that. But this will allow me to move a little bit behind the podium, because between the laptop and the Columbia, which we must thank very much, sign, and my short height, you may not see me, and you may just think it's a podium that speaks, which my students often talk about. Tonight, I've decided, since we are trying to think about things in terms of both science, technology, as well as what we call art, that I would talk a little bit about how these people in the Paleolithic were engaged in a process. I think I liked what Chet just said about people mobilizing culture, making culture, working at a culture. But they actually did this through both their understanding of the material world as well as the symbolic worlds that they created. So let's see if I can get us going here. The three main topics that I'll talk about tonight, as you can see, a little bit about reviewing what some of the images and so forth are from this corpus of Paleolithic art, and a little bit about its context, talk a little bit about the materiality and what we call the socio-technics, if you will, of image making. And then lastly, some ideas about how maybe some of what we see from this huge corpus of materials that was produced over 25,000 years, that it might have been a lot about memory, about making meaning, and about mobilizing culture. So first of all, I'm going to ask all of you to drop, if you can, some of your presuppositions. Here are some traditional kind of images of Lascaux, dated to 17,000 years ago. Chauvet, where many of the images there are dated to 34,000 years ago. And most of the time we look at these as if they're flat, two-dimensional, on a wall, a flat wall. But they're not like that at all. We really have to change our way of seeing in order to understand their way of seeing and being. So divorce yourself from the idea that this is something you'd like on a framed picture over your couch. Forget it. It's not that way. The other problem is that most of what we think we know about Paleolithic art comes from a very non-random selection of materials. We always see the same ones over and over, the bison from Altamira, the horse you just saw from Lascaux, and so forth. But there is a lot of stuff and a lot of amazing imagery, and a lot of it isn't all within what we say is so spectacular, so sophisticated, beautiful horses, beautiful bison showing the musculature, and so on and so forth. So whoever sees some of these kinds of pictures, that's my level of drawing, just a little animal with an ibex, a blob, it may be a bison, line drawings and things that are completely on top of each other, a veritable palimpsest of all sorts of engraved images. In that case, there are more engraved images from Lascaux than there are painted ones, and nobody ever really heralds that kind of information. So we're dealing with what most of us think of Paleolithic art as a selected sample, and we tend to think that's all there is, or that's mostly what there is. Whoever sees images like this, we don't actually show some of these images, the little hut-like structure, as some people say, the geometric sign, a little enigmatic face, as you can see here, carved on the wall at Marsulis. So again, we're trying hard to expand our understanding of what it is. So the other part of it is that it's really three-dimensional. So we're going to go into a cave. We're going to go into the decorated cave of Marsulis. And here we go. Let's see if I can get this to go. I need to, right, start this somehow. Okay. It's a long, narrow cave. There's paintings, there's engravings. You can see that the cave walls are not flat surfaces. Enigmatic symbols, long lines, little attachments on them. Animals using the shape, purple, and those little lined things on that orange bison. The bison made with a thumbprint in pigment. All of those little dots are all thumbprints. Just about towards the end of this little corridor. And we're left with an image. Maybe it's Charles de Gaulle. So what we're going to talk a little bit about then is how people produced a visual culture through what we can call the socio-technics of image making. People were working within their worlds. They really knew their materials. Image making is very embodied practices, individuals in strange locations, reaching around, very much involved in it. We know that they knew about pigments, they processed pigments, they used special tools for engraving. So we really have to think about everything that was behind the bringing of these images into existence. Paleolithic art, just a quick review. As far as we know, this particular manifestation is in Greater Europe, across into Russia. It tends to date from more than 32,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. And the repetitiveness, over and overness of it is definitely associated with modern humans, which doesn't rule out the fact that some Neanderthals actually engaged as well with materials, cultures, and forms, although this is a subject of considerable debate. It's got almost every single imaginable kind of technical process: painting, engraving, carving, sculpting, three-dimensionality, little figures. We have the famous so-called Chinese horse from Lascaux. We have the way in which the cave wall at Cognac is involved with using the natural parts of the wall to indicate the shaggy coat of the ibex. And we have images like that from Les Trois Frères, where we have all of the images, one and piled on top of each other. It's a huge and amazing kind of repertoire. The replicative image making begins, as we see, more or less in Euro-Russia around 34,000 years ago. We have these wonderful little figurines, tiny little figurines made out of ivory from some of the sites in southwestern Germany. And you can see that making beads and other kinds of things, presumably for ornamentation on human bodies, also is there from the very, very beginning, as well as from other sites. I just read the report by Mary Steiner on some of the beads that were made at very early Upper Paleolithic sites on the coast of Turkey. So this is something that's not just here, but is pretty widespread. We have to remember that modern humans are late to Europe. There is early art, if you want to call it that, elsewhere in the world. And I have to say that my French colleagues are very upset that actually there might have been early image making in Australia before in France. Mon Dieu. And it says here that, you know, this particular slide, as early humans migrated around the globe, image making spread rapidly, but it probably wasn't something that spread from a single hearth, if you will, something that was independently invented, probably in many different places, as humans engaged with the material world for symbolic purposes. The kind of media are phenomenal. These kind of little spear thrower, you can see the little hook here, this kind of engraving. This is possibly a child's toy with a little hole in the middle that if you put a string through it and you pull it, it goes, spins all around like crazy. Engraved moans and antlers by the thousands. We definitely have some figurines. You know the famous ones. I don't even need to show you images of them because they're so widespread. But some of the less well-known from Avdievo in the Ukraine, and there actually are male figurines. You can see, as my French colleagues would say, le sexe. And then we have enigmatic ones that may be combined. This is the so-called lion man from Geisenklosterlee in southwestern Germany. Thousands of pieces of bone and antler, engraved, carved, with all sorts of different kinds of designs on them. And there is open air image making, for such as that from Fazcoa in Portugal. So what kind of lives did these people lead? How did these groups of small mobile hunter-gatherers actually develop ways to use the material world to connect across distances, which is one of the things they did? How does image making actually lead to what has been called the release from proximity? That is, you don't need to be right with people that you're connected with, that you can use the material world to connect yourself to people, and you can therefore spread your connectivities, your relationships, and interactions over a long way, which, as Clive Gamble has suggested, this variability of humans to release themselves from only intimate relations actually was one of the things that led to people being very effective settlers. Of course, it's our primate heritage, the vision. We have binocular vision, we have three-chrome vision. And so in some ways, to think about how this all happened, we do have to dip into our human evolution, think a little bit about visual thinking. We know now that the whole notion of visual culture among humans goes back a long ways, especially with the work with the ochre from the Blompos Cave and other cave sites in southern Africa. And we have, as you can see, a number of going through to the very early manifestations at the Chauvet Cave, and then all the way up to the Altamira from 15,000. These are some sites that you can actually visit either in real or in replica. And of course, there is the ongoing debate about the visual culture that our predecessors, Neanderthals, and of course, I don't know, at lunchtime today, we discovered lots of us in the room actually have had our DNA done and are very proud that we have Neanderthal DNA. So I'm even a bigger fan of Neanderthal now that I am one, right? So people have talked about whether what kinds of things are going on with the making of these incredibly symmetrical hand axes, or with the predetermined shapes of stone tools made by Neanderthals in the Mousterian, the so-called Levallois core, and possibly some amulets and other kinds of material forms made by Neanderthals. And this is a wonderful debate, and we could go on about it for some time, but just know that this is a really interesting part of it. We really need to dip into visual culture studies and understand more about visual thinking in order to approach this. How are things made visible? What technologies are used and how, and what are the specific qualities of the objects, the visual objects that people actually make? What things are made visual? And what is the development of a situated eye? That is, we all don't see the same things, especially from one culture to another. What is made invisible and why are some things made invisible? For many, many years, the standard on all of this was a book by Rudolf Arnheim, who argued that all thinking, not just related to art, but that all thinking was basically perceptual in nature, and that the ancient dichotomy between seeing and thinking, between perceiving and reasoning, was a false and misleading one. More recently, Whitney Davis, an art historian, has taken up the whole theory of visual culture with his book of a couple of years ago, in which he talks about what is cultural about vision, what is visual about cultural. So these are some of the resources to draw upon. And of course, vision is cognitively and culturally mediated. It is unlikely that the models in ancient Egypt actually stood like that. Well, just a little ethnographic example to help us grasp a little bit more about the so-called situated eye. There is a group of people, the Abalam, who are really quite famous for the studies done of their art by a number of social anthropologists, Anthony Forge, Marilyn Strathern, and in which painting is a sacred activity. They don't actually recognize different colors, they recognize different paints, and don't see other colors than the ones that are in their paints. One of the things that's interesting here is that perhaps you can see these apparent faces on here. These faces refer to spirits. They are not representing spirits. They refer to spirits only in certain contexts. And so they do not represent them, but are one of several different media through which the spirits are manifest. So it may well be when we look at Paleolithic art and we think they're representing a horse, the horse may be just a referent for spirits or other kinds of meanings, and that in certain contexts, the horse itself is about a much more expansive notion of horseness than just a representation of a biological animal that they happen to see. So again, we have to stretch our understanding. We like to think that they've represented a horse, but maybe there's a lesson from people like the Abalam about how images are actually only mobilizing other meanings rather than being taken literally in this case, as faces, or in the case of Paleolithic art, as a horse. So the question is how, when we want to study this stuff, can the anthropology of art help us in any way? And thinking about visual culture. And of course, is the art of other cultures, especially non-Western or small-scale societies, is it about the objects they're producing? Is it about the social matrix? Is it about wider social phenomena, or in fact about both? So one of the interesting things, especially the work of the Australian anthropologist Howard Morphy, is that we trip over the use of the word art. So I've always been hesitant, along with others, about calling this Paleolithic art. It's probably not art to them, it's life probably to them. And what Morphy suggests is we need a different concept of art, one that doesn't distance the products of other societies from Western art, but doesn't appropriate those images into our own cultural understandings. So it's a very difficult dilemma that we actually haven't solved yet, one of many. So the point to stress here is that there are technologies of making, technologies of social relations, and differential actions of art and image making that are embedded in different ways of seeing. We think everybody sees what we see, but that's probably not the case. You have to be conditioned to seeing things in certain ways. And objects and images can be made with attention to detail, yet, of course, since we cannot look at these objects of the past as if they were on display for us, one of the things we can do as archaeologists, in a broad sense of the term, is look at the work that goes into them, because we do have access to that. So by now, what I'm trying to get us towards is that there is an inevitable intersection between visuality and materiality, that somehow we've got to work with both dimensions. They're not just images to be looked at, but they are actually images that are made out of materials, and behind every material that is used, there is a whole series of actions, resources, people, social relations. So the only way that a painting is going to get onto the wall, we call it a painting or a drawing, is that if somebody knows where the pigment is in the region, if somebody knows, somebody has the cultural authorization to go and collect that pigment, somebody knows how to prepare that pigment, somebody knows how to put it together with other things so that the pigment sticks together, so that the pigment sticks on the wall. So before you ever get a painting, you actually have to have all of that social labor, social relations, and knowledge systems that lie behind it. And those are the kinds of things that we can make inferences about in contemporary world. So behind any one of these paintings, there are also, of course, who's going to do it, who's got the social and cultural authorization to do it, who's going to hold the lamp that you can see with, who's going to prepare the pigments. So there's all of this that are actually inferential to us. So what then are some additional ways to think about the Paleolithic cave art? There have been multiple interpretations over more than a century. This was a material and cultural and visual production that lasted for millennia, probably at least 25,000 years. Now talk about a tradition. It can't possibly mean the same thing to everybody over a long time. What is it about us that demands that we have a single overarching explanation that we can take away with us and be satisfied with? It's much more fun if it's complicated. The major interpretations, you may know some of them, starting with the first discoveries or re-encounters with what we consider today to be Paleolithic art, was that it was sympathetic hunting magic that was based on new ideas at the time in the 19th century from Australian Aboriginal observations. A big major publication by Spencer and Gillen. This whole idea was challenged in the 1960s when people were thinking about the underlying structures of human thought, especially mobilized by people like Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist. And Leroi-Gourhan thought that instead of animals being something that were good to eat in a hunting magic hypothesis, they were good to think in a more structuralist kind of hypothesis. And then there was a whole cadre of those of us trained in the Anglo-American schools of anthropological thought that viewed the art as being some kind of an adaptive thing, something that made a difference in human life, that it was information that was being used to solve certain social problems, and then the work suggesting that some of it anyway was the marking of time, marking of seasonality, giving sort of a coded structure to everyday life. And most recently, of course, we have the ideas of Jean-Claude and David Lewis Williams suggesting that much, but not all, but much of the imagery may have been the products of individuals who went into altered states of consciousness, had visions, and then came into the caves and painted some of the kinds of things that they had seen in their cognitive conscious travels. So one of the things, as I say here, and will again at the end, is do we have to choose only one? Do you have your favorite interpretation? But we have to remember that symbols are by their very nature multivocal. We depend on the open-endedness of symbols to be interpreted, reinterpreted, used, and reused, except, of course, when symbols are made sacred. Then, of course, you have an unquestioned acceptance of certain symbols being referenced for certain kinds of things. But basically, to me, one of the exciting things about open-endedness of symbols is that they can spawn additional interpretations, that as situations change, as culture change, as social relations change, you can take the same symbols and you can rework them to meet the new circumstances. So they have a certain semiotic inevitability and ongoingness, which is one of the important parts of the symbols that we are very dependent upon. So these people, again, as I say, are people working within their worlds. They knew their materials well. Their entire technologies, toolkits, savoir-faire, if you will, about how to work with the material and these social relations of production. Or as I said earlier, since we cannot look at such objects as if they are on display, we look at the work that goes into them. So that brings us to what were people doing in the caves? In many caves and rock shelters, people had occupation, lived there, occupied, built fires, processed animals, made stone tools, many of those other kinds of things. But many of the cave sites that have the art and imagery in it do not have extensive occupation in it. These are not places where people went to live all the time, but this is where people went to do certain other cultural kinds of things. Oh, they had lunch. I mean, there's some reindeer bones in Lascaux and some of those other kinds of things. They, certainly did some of these things, but deep occupation deposits in general do not go with any of the decorated caves. And it's very unlikely that this was image making for the whole gang, for everybody. We don't have evidence that these places were revisited over and over again, that the floors were tread often, or that there's many of the images were just made once and then that was that. And yet at the same time, there are other images and other places and parts of caves where there's correction, over marking, touching up, rejuvenating some of the pigments. And so we've got different kinds of things. And although we know we have some children in some of these caves from the footprints and from some of the handprints on the walls, nonetheless, it's really probably not something that was an everyday, everybody in the group lets everybody go into the cave today. So this is, for many people in those societies, this was imagery, but it wasn't visible. They weren't looking at it. They knew about it. They knew that it was there. So what do you do with non-visible imagery? How does that work in human life? So what kinds of things have people been trying to do to sort of dig into these materials, to find out much more about how the imagery was made and what that could have meant for our understanding a little bit more about what the whole process was all about? So the archaeology of decorated caves and of material practices is something that people have been concentrated on to a great extent lately. There is this French concept known as the chaîne opératoire, which is the sequence of things, that everything starts with this, and then you do that. And so really looking at the technical and social acts, the performance, if you will, of actually making some of these things, thinking as well that maybe the meanings of some of these things are not necessarily in the finished object, but are in the whole process of making something, that was perhaps as important as some end result, some object, some image that would be celebrated for in and of itself. And secondly, some people have been looking at this as what's going on here is in part memory work. And we'll look at some of the examples of how some of these kinds of deposition, caches left behind, as well as some intentional destruction was also part of what was going on with many of these images. So you can see here some of the kinds of things that might lie behind, say, the images at Lascaux, where we do have evidence for some scaffolding. There are processing of ochre hematite. There are lamps, some beautifully made, and some just opportunistic pieces that were used. We know about the oils that they used, the animal fat that was used. We know about the wick that was used, which they had to have. You know, we all go into these caves with nice lights on their heads and big flashlights and so on and so forth. But you can be sure they didn't have such things back then. And we know a lot about the pigments. We know where the sources are, how they were processed. We have ochres, for example, here in the lower left with striation marks on it. We have tools that were used for engraving. And this bull at Lascaux appears as if it was rejuvenated or retouched over many, probably thousands of years, because the original black is covered with a calcite layer, and then there's more black on top of it, and then another calcite layer. And calcite just doesn't happen to form overnight, so it is something that was revisited and reused and rejuvenated. There was something powerful about this particular image that led to that kind of attention. So we're wondering also whether these people were into craft specialization. Well, this is not something that's supposed to come along until we get to the agriculturalists of the Neolithic. Well, sorry. We've got this over and over again replication. These are what are called contour découpé, or little horse and ibex cutouts. But what's interesting about some of them, as you can see with these horse here, and this was a nice study on the standardization of them, is that the horse's heads, which are about this big, are made out of the throat bone of the horse. So it's a horse from a horse. And so you do get the sense that there's something horsey going on, something important and powerful about whatever that signifies. We can see, again, the so-called lion man from Geisenklosterle in southwestern Germany, and that somebody has estimated in trying to make a replica, it took them 400 hours. And those are the burins that they used to make it. These are not just one-offs. I think I'll sit down and crack something out. There was something about the making of these things that was very meaningful and part of really engaged attention. We also see some standardization. Who would imagine these two sites are about 50 kilometers away from each other? We have one from the site of Le Mastazil. This is a spear thrower with a little hook on the end, an ibex, the head turning back, a hook on the end, an ibex with the head turning back. So we've got two artifacts that look unlikely to have been independently invented 50 kilometers away from each other. So either the same person making them is on the move and leaves them at two different sites, or there is some sort of agreement about what a spear thrower should look like in terms of standardized. So the idea then of taking seriously some of the meanings were in the making. One of the other dimensions has been the work on pigments. Pigments are actually chemically analyzable. The science of pigment analysis is very well developed. We can understand that some pigments were mixed with biotite and various other kinds of things, and that there are actually identifiable recipes that people used, and that recipe at one site you can find at another site. So you actually know that there was communication, engagement with the way to make a particular pigment using particular properties. And some of the pigments are on cave walls, and others, such as in this reindeer antler on a piece of portable art, you can see that it's pigment's been imprinted into the portable art. So it's not just pigmentation and pigment processing for the cave walls, but for the portable art as well. We've been looking at the so-called sequence of how an image came to be. So in the lower right, you have some of the famous rhinos from Chauvet Cave. And you can see that Gilles Tossello from Toulouse has actually understood exactly the steps through which those rhinos were made, how the art was actually, the image was actually made, what came first, and so forth. So you can see him actually in the cave at Lascaux working with some of the images there. Also in Chauvet is this perhaps enigmatic image. If you look at it, you say, well, it could be kind of an animal, a little hump on the top, and maybe it's an elephant or a bison, the leg in the front and in the back. But upon closer inspection, and with a little bit of modern, media technology, it's actually clear that this was hand with pigment on the palm of the hand applied to the cave wall. So you can see all of the directions, it's the same hand. They can identify it, the same sort of little bump in where the fingers go. So you know that one person did this, and he or she put their hand all around it like that. So, well, so what? That's really, is that interesting? Yeah, it's performative image making. People are intently facing the wall, intently performing the image making, putting their hand up there. Is this just merely connecting with the surface? Or is this connecting with what's in the surface or behind the surface? In terms of some of the notions that Lewis Williams and Claude have argued for, that there were spirits and that the wall is oftentimes conceived of as a veil between the here and now and the other spirits and the other sort of ways of being. One way to possibly think about it. Again, another cave site, very fascinating, unusual. This is the site of Le Duc de Robert in the Ariège region of France, the wonderful new book the last couple of years on the secret sanctuary of the bison, where way at the back of the cave, at least in terms of the access today, there are these several bison that have been made out of clay. So how does this happen? They find the place where they probably went for the cave for the clay. They have a whole array of heel prints. People were walking around like this, not on their whole foot, and making, as you can see on the upper level, the clay bison. So how do you make a clay bison? You get the clay and you start molding it and shaping it. It's an embodied, very physical kind of thing. It's not just bison sitting there. It's all this that's really a part of what's going on as well. How to actually mold and make and shape and get it up there and against a piece of rock that's in the middle of the cave. Paleolithic gestures have become really interesting. We find in almost 30 different caves bones just stuck in the cave walls or in the floor. This is something that previous researchers focused on the imagery never would have seen. This is what a very close forensic analysis of the caves are like. And actually 13 of these many caves are in the Pyrenees, where you can see here in the middle, let's see, these caves stuck in the wall. So this leads us into the idea that maybe some of this is about memorizing, about making memory, memorializing in some sort of way. Of course, the study of memory has gone on for many, many decades, at least in the West. You can see the important basic memory on collective memory by Halsbach back in the early 1950s, and both in general and art history, acts of memory, cultural recall in the present by a group of art historians recently, and then in archaeology, and talking about it as memory work, starting with the Connerton sociology approach in the late 1980s and several different important books, including the one edited by Barbara Mills and William Walker on memory work. So how do we identify memory work? This seems to be kind of abstract. Researchers suggest that things like deposition, sticking bones in the floor or in cracks, is one way in which you're inserting a memorable occasion. We can look at this wonderful drawing of the Chapel of the Lion, as it's called, in Les Trois Frères. In the middle, the person that's carving with the antlers on, there's a fabulous lion, cave lion, carved there. But on the side is a stone tool. And on the other side, stuck in the side, is another stone tool. The stone tool on the right is made from a local flint. The stone tool on the left is made from an exotic or faraway flint. If you turn around and look at the wall behind it, there are two pieces of flint in the wall. One is local and one is from far away. That doesn't happen by chance. There's something about the local and the non-local, which may have been part of their network anyway, but to us, they're different geographic locations, behind you and in front of you. There's something special about that just couldn't happen randomly. Many of these archaeological sites, which of course have been fantastic for us as archaeologists, is people left stuff behind. Why would you leave behind a beautiful spear thrower like that? Why would you leave behind this magnificent, evocative head of a horse sort of neighing or whinnying, just a tiny little carving like that? Why would you have a cache of all of these little horses, ibex heads, cut out and left all together in a place? What was that going to be there? Were you going to come back? Was this something that you left for some other reason? So we've got these, and there's certainly seem to occur mostly at sites that we call super sites or aggregation sites, where there's a lot of evidence that people came together at certain times of the year who were otherwise dispersed in smaller groups, coming together for social events, for gathering, for mate exchange, for maybe even making some of this abundant material culture. Some sites have instances where images are intentionally marked out, as at the site of Cosquer, handprint that has been later just marked out. And the same with another one where you see the red painting over the handprint. And there are sites with what we definitely intentional destruction. At the site of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic today, a site occupied 26,000 years ago, fantastic. On the one hand, they had a kiln. They knew about clay. They made things out of clay. They heated them to high temperatures, not pottery. We all think that that comes along for the first time with the Neolithic Revolution. Paleolithic peoples knew about the properties of clay, that you could heat it to high temperatures and it would have a different shape and a different form and a different hardness, if you will. So, but here at Dolní Věstonice, they also poured water on these clay objects, threw them in the fire, and they exploded. Is that, the kind of thinking of an art object? Is it art as we know it, or is it about other things and not about a finished object to behold, which is what we tend to think. Why would you make something like that, female figurine, little statuettes, and explode it? It's about the process, not the product. There's something else going on that we have to remember. So yet there is reuse, creation, and enactment. At the Grotte Chauvet, you can actually see the way in which a wall in the Chauvet cave started out with cave bear scratchings on the wall, followed by adding some images, erasing them, all that whiteness in the middle there, then starting to gradually add things. And what we see is the fantastic panel of the horses, beautifully made, but they were just part of an ongoing reenactment process. And of course, you can see the same thing with the overuse and the overlay of images from the Duc d'Audebert. And of course, we can also see at Chauvet how some of this was done over several millennia, because fortunately for us, much of the drawings in Chauvet Cave were done with charcoal, so we've been able to date it. And there are fireplaces, remains of charcoal right in the cave. So we know that Chauvet was occupied 30,000 years ago, and then not again until about 22,000 years ago. So we see some of the same places, images placed one over another. What is this telling us? There are also embodied practices, way of memorializing the body. We've got some burials, not many, but some of them are really fantastic, such as the one from Sungir in Russia, with thousands of beads, and you can see on the lower right what the person might have looked like when they were laid to rest, the skeleton as encountered by the archaeologist, and the way in which beads were made, a whole sequencing. They knew how to take a piece of raw material and cut it up into beads. Beads are pretty everywhere in that. But also, of course, to get into some of these places, just the physical squiggling and wiggling that you have to do to go under, to get in, really turn an art image, if you will, into an embodied physical practice. Especially you can see this guy up here at Chauvet climbing up on the rocks to put a little image up there. And of course, this is what you have to do today even to get into some of the caves on the lower left. So basically, I think what we can think about is not that this is hunting magic or something abstracted from everyday social life, but it's imagery that is produced and reproduced and even transformed over millennia through social labor and social practices. We may never know what these meanings are. We have lots of challenges and lots of delights from looking at this. We are still faced with the problematics of art. We tend to situate this from our own perspective, the overburden of our notions. We know that in ethnographic documented societies, they don't often have a term for art. The images they make are not art, separate from religion, separate from economics, separate from social relations. They're fully integrated. And of course, that gives us hope that if that was the case in the Paleolithic, we might actually have access to some of those other dimensions. We might be able to say something about some of these things because the image making was integrally related to those other dimensions of human life. We need to get our eyes screwed on right and for different contexts, cultures, and practices. And we are insistent that all of this needs to be within our own cultural prowess. We go back to then. What if this is actually more about difference than about similarities? We want that connection. We need that connection in some ways, but maybe it's about alterity, difference, rather than about sameness in some sort of way. Why are we wanting it to be? Why are we enchanted by these and not by other images, ancient images? Why do we have a preference for this? The cover of Time magazine, admittedly, is really out of date, both chronologically and so forth, because I don't think early anatomically humans looked like Rembrandt with blue eyes and white skin if they came from Africa. It's really, really unlikely. So we have to say the way we were. Who do you mean we? And of course, with Newsweek, they've pitched this to us as if it's the New York Times Sunday magazine section. Our Ice Age heritage, language, art, fashion, and the family. That's what we read about, what we want, but are these the terms that we can use? We've got to get ourselves into other contexts, other ways of thinking. We may never know the meanings. I don't despair that fact. We work away at it. We use scientific technologies. We use pigment analysis. We use chaîne opératoire. We use anything and everything available to us to try and come to deeper, more robust, more multifaceted understanding. But of course, we do find in their images, we do find our own meanings. We do visit the caves. We are taken aback by the use of color, the way in which they understood the shapes of the cave, the way in which they used them to bring out images. Maybe they thought that that bison was in the ceiling at Lascaux, which they just touched up the ceiling bump to make it a bison rump. We, of course, definitely, the New Yorker is a professional deduction for me. In terms of my taxes, there's always something in the New Yorker that I have to keep up with. This one was called Cave Opening, right? But of course, when we think about nailing it down in some sort of way, we have to also remember that archaeology is not just about the past or coming up with some sort of way in which we've pulled it all together and have the past before us. but it's about our relationships with the past. What are our relationships with these past people and what they made and did, and how do we find our own meanings in some of these kinds of things? So, as I have many acknowledgments for all the work that I've done, I go back to my professor at the University of Chicago, Les Freeman, the late Les Freeman, who boldly suggested I might get interested in looking at Paleolithic art. And I can tell you, at the time, 50 years ago, archaeology was not thinking that that was something you really worked on. We were very narrow scientists back in the middle 60s. And if you couldn't test it, and of course, if you couldn't date it, how could you do anything with it? But Les really encouraged me. I did my master's thesis on the interpretation of Paleolithic art, and I've been working away at it for a long time. I don't have the answer tied up in a box with a red bow on it, but I think we've all learned an enormous amount. Many different colleagues. I can't thank my French and Spanish colleagues enough for all of this kind of thing that they've been able to give to me. And then to close, of course, how do we account for this art? How do we account for what it is? The preservation problem. Why don't we have anything earlier? What's missing? What can we infer? How do we do that? What are all the different possibilities? And probably, actually, all of them might be part of the story. So I'm going to leave you with, whoops, the last, not the end of the slideshow, but let's see if I get my, here we go. What you're about to see is about a 5-minute, if we have 5 minutes, video. One of the first three-dimensional videos done with point clouds from the Chauvet Cave. So we're going to walk through the Chauvet Cave. We're going to see a lot of point clouds, and we're going to hear some animal noises, because that's what it's about. So let's see if we can go there. Do we have the sound on? Yeah, I'm up. Thank you. I think we have time for questions. Yeah.
This is recorded, so please wait for the microphone before you ask the questions.
So this man here in the white blue shirt, color, right?
The white hair. I'd like to ask about your endpoint 10,000 years ago. Is that arbitrary, or did all of a sudden people didn't paint in caves anymore?
Yeah.
Why do we, what?
All of a sudden, people didn't paint in caves anymore, right? Yeah.
It just went out of fashion? That seems so unlikely that it didn't sort of peter out.
Right. Well, you know, I have a colleague in Spain who once wrote a fun article called "When the Beasts Go Marching Out." And it's probably related to a very gradual but eventual climate change, resource change, reorganization of communities. Many of the people, at least in the Pyrenees, retreated into the Pyrenees, more refugia, shifting diets. The reindeer left, the other animals left, the sea started changing. So it was a whole reorganization of life. Now there are some small objects, painted pebbles and things like that. But whatever was going on with the relationship between people and the animals and their social lives or whatever changed. And it probably changed gradually. We see that people are not going as far afield in terms of connections or getting resources like important flint and so forth. There does seem to be a turning in many parts of France and Spain where these caves are. So it really was a tradition or an engagement or an action that wasn't meaningful anymore. I mean, my real question is not what does this mean, what is its meaning, but why would all of this be meaningful in what kinds of contexts to those people? I know what it means, you know, how meaningful it is to me, but I don't think we can ever find a meaning, but I really work on towards the end of the Pleistocene, towards the end of the Ice Age, changed conditions and social relations and so forth so much that it no longer held the meaningness that it had previously. Yeah. Yeah. She needs that. Oh, he's.
How come we don't see any humans portrayed here?
We do have occasional humans. We saw in the Marsulis one, we see some faces and some unusual ones. But the people, I think the people were there, because of course they're doing the image making. And who can tell us that the people aren't in the animals?
Well, doesn't every artist have a self-portrait?
In an individualistic, self-centered society, probably. But I'm not thinking that these people were necessarily individualistic, self-centered in the same way that we think about quote-unquote modern artists. And they may have been making self-portraits. We just don't know how to recognize them. I mean, we know from many Native American groups, for example, that having a relationship with an animal is one of the things that makes you a human. I know many of these people are expressing their humanness through their relationships with animals. Yeah, and there are figurines of males and females, so it's not that, and there are on some of the engravings, there are oftentimes little characters, and there's a wonderful array of faces inscribed on some plaquettes from the site of La Marche, and some of the figures on there are just fabulous. There's one that looks just like Charles Darwin, but it dates to 12,000 years ago. So we know it couldn't be the case. But anyway, it's a question that everybody always asks, and you have to realize that, and you know, somehow this selfie notion just hadn't hit yet, right? Okay, there's a microphone someplace. There's bunches of folks over here and in the back row, right? Yeah.
Is there anything that you can recognize as an artist who paints more than one and has a style?
Oh, yeah.
Or
yeah.
teacher and students or anything that
Right.
can...
Well, the horses at Chauvet, for example, are all done by the same hand. It's very clear that they've been done, and the people who look at that, we also can recognize in other caves. There has been quite a bit of work on that, where they can recognize certain ways of doing the hooves of bison or something like that, that is very distinctive and obviously was done by somebody, one of the same sorts of persons. So, yeah, so there's a little literature on that. So.
About teacher-student relation there? Somebody copying?
Well, you know, the thing is that when it's on the cave wall, it's very hard to have a copy unless you're right there in front of it, you know. So, but of course, they could see something and then take it someplace else. And then the copy becomes what they remember rather than any kind of copy in our sort of sense of the word. And who knows, there may have been, the people who did this may have been members of secret societies, as we have from ethnographically known groups. They may have been specialists. We do know that there are probably apprentices, at least people who are learning how to do all of this, that people's analyses, especially of engraving and carving, can show where individuals are experimenting, and sometimes they're using cast-off materials, if you will, sort of like not the best piece of antler, but something that's not quite so good in terms of its texture and form, and are practicing with it. And we know this from stone tool making in the Upper Paleolithic as well. So, you know, clearly there are people engaged in the whole making process, and as I say, there are these social relations of that. Who's the learner? Who gets selected? On what criteria? Is somebody going to keep going? So, you know, these are all, you know, absolutely fascinating questions. On the day they invent that time machine, I know exactly what time and where I want to be for my day in the past, right? Right. There's someone with a, okay, you got a microphone, right?
Earlier in the lecture, you made a point of saying that there's several Paleolithic sites throughout the world.
Right.
I was wondering, first of all, are there any common themes or painting techniques or that you see in several different geographic areas? And my second question based off of that is, does this point to a common origin of that particular theme or technique or whatever, you know, whatever is common, or was it developed independently in those different geographic areas?
I would say that it's mostly independent. I mean, for example, if you contrast some of the early Aboriginal Australian art and so forth, it's not these big animals. These big animals weren't there, for example. They didn't even have hoofed animals in Australia until the British colonists brought them. One thing that we see everywhere are hands. There's something about the hand, whether it's the hand in connection with the surface or other dimensions of what it means to put your hand on something, and that is really quite widespread.
Maybe that was their selfie, their way
That was there. So, well, some people think that, but it could also be this business of making contact with the wall and anything that's in it or behind it or whatever. So I think, again, we can't even generalize. We tend to work from our own thing, like, oh, I was here I am, or whatever. And sometimes, we know from some of the Australian ones, it's just fun. A woman is there doing some image making. She has her kid with her. And she sticks her kid's foot in the paint pot and sticks the kid's foot up on the wall. Well, didn't have any significance in the sense that it was just sort of fun to do. Yeah. There's a couple over here. Anna.
Thank you very much for emphasizing how distinctive regional traditions can be, that it wasn't always the same thing. And thank you also for reminding us that the Upper Paleolithic, these wonderful artists probably looked nothing like most of us here today, especially considering the recent DNA studies of people even only 9,000 years ago in Europe having very dark skin and hair. I just wanted to quickly mention the Amazonian Indians would absolutely agree with you about animals being practically their souls. Right. And one of my former students and I have been working in rock art area of Brazil in the Amazon, and recently through his dissertation he established that the art there that has both stick figure humans and animals that are a little bit more developed but still very geometric, and a lot of geometric designs that look like suns and stars, they turned out to be very non-randomly distributed vis-a-vis the sun. And he established that basically they were watching the sun from solstice to solstice, and that the clumps of stick figure people and the animals may have been constellations. He later researched ethnographic literature called star lore, where ethnographers had taken the trouble to really listen to the myths, how they were worded. And it turns out that even extant myths, even though these Paleo-Indians stopped making the paintings at 10,000, like that, bang, 13,000 to 10,000, bang, stopped, that was it. The fact is, people still remember the whole issue of the sun and those figures, and the way they talk about the creation story with all the titans and the giants and the killings and all the terrible things that amazing things that happen, is that it's an interaction between the sun and these deities, and they tell it like the zodiac. So they have the sun passing through these figures in these myths. It's explicit. So it's strange how people remember even though they aren't participating anymore.
Right. Yeah, right. Thank you. Also, from the Amazon, for example, we were having a conversation the other day about how can it be that peccaries are humans, or humans are peccaries, which are the pigs, right? But in certain contexts, peccaries are humans, or humans are peccaries, right?
Well, once, Amazonians would say once, we were kin, and all animals were human, and humans were animals. Everybody talked and walked and mated and whatnot. But then when the world was created and many things happened and we became separate from the other world, then we couldn't look like an animal except in our minds.
Right. It's a good place to hold things right there.
Thank you. All
right. Oh.
Can you comment on the time span that the art was created in any particular cave? Were these works created over a span of a short period of time or many centuries?
Well, people have done some experiments, and for example, in the cave of Peshmerga, which is in the Lot region, one of the archaeologists there, Michel Laure-Blanchet, went in to reproduce the so-called black frieze, which is just some outlines of animals. He was able to do it in an hour or two, really quickly. Other things look like and I certainly know from some of the making of the engraved objects, those can take a long time. And other images probably took, some time, but you had to have the right ingredients, the right pigments and painting and so forth. But I think they were, any given image was probably done in one sitting, but the composition of them, adding things. And of course, this is where we get tripped up with our own, what shall I call it, chronocentrality, where we always want to control time. We probably can't ever figure out, how much time elapsed between the making of one image and another, unless you've got something like that black bull from Lascaux, which has the calcite formation over it before the next application of pigment. So it's very hard, but people are doing, and they did this a lot at Chauvet. The wonderful thing about Chauvet Cave is that it didn't get discovered until by us modern people until 1994. If it had been found in the 1920s or 30s, we would never know as much as we do now. They're doing things like the stratigraphy of cave paintings with little tiny like corings, like tree ring core, but little tiny corings, where they can then look at the accumulation of the pigment and what went on for what different image. So they actually can get a little time scale of how long and what little interventions there were between the applications of pigment. So there's some really fascinating work going on along those lines. But some of it was, right? And others of it was, mix the pigment, put it on. And a lot of them are not really paintings. A lot of them are drawings, where they're actually using the pigment or some mixture of the pigment and smeared on. So, yeah.
Thank you. You spoke of the end of this era abruptly at 10,000 years ago, and my understanding is that it abruptly began as well right around 35,000 years ago, and we see musical instruments appearing at that point.
Musical
but
instruments,
not
yeah.
earlier.
Right.
And so I've read in terms of it appears that cognitive development changed, that language and symbolic reasoning was abruptly introduced because we see a lot of technological innovation at that moment. But I still stop and just reflect on that amazing idea of the invention of art itself. It's just so extraordinary. The whole history of art is about creativity, and here we are creating creativity. And I'd really be interested in hearing you reflect on that. I'm not sure how else to express the question.
Right. Well, I think that to think that all of this happened in an explosive sort of way, some people have argued for that, is probably unlikely to have been the case. And especially at only 35,000 years ago, we have anatomically modern humans at maybe 200,000 years ago coming out of Africa. We have them living in the Middle East. We have them showing up in places like Australia at 55, 60,000 years ago. So, and they're engaged in image making from the very beginning there. So I think trying to pinpoint, some of these cultural rubricons that suddenly everything all came together. I think the making of it and everything, we're fooled by the preservation factor, and we don't think about what doesn't preserve, what kinds of image making could have been done in much more ephemeral signs, in wood, on the ground, many of these other things which we know from ethnographic societies. Not everybody has, so wonderfully created a corpus of preserved materials for us to study. So I think we have to be careful about thinking that just because we have a material manifestation that survived to the present, this is the beginning of something. So for me, what I'm interested in is, okay, if we do have this that starts to appear at that time, what is it, what's going on that this starts to happen in this place? And I don't know why it happened in Australia as it did, or other places that it did, in Indonesia, or some of these other places where we've got some early dates and so forth. So I'm really focused on, what happened in that one particular context, kind of context. What was it about the life ways and the needs and so forth? And there's a whole list of things. I mean, did it have any, the particular manifestations in, say, Southwestern Europe? Did this have anything to do with the fact that when anatomically moderns got there, there were already people there? There were already Neanderthals there who'd been there for a long time? Is there something about that kind of a context that sort of elicits some sort of material engagement? And I don't think this is all just full blown. And, I think there was a lot of engagement. We know, people with ochre and Southern Africa, people working with materials in all sorts of ways. So I'm not so much on the symbolic explosion bandwagon. I think there has to be.
We see this stuff suddenly showing up in many different areas. Beads.
Right,
So,
well, yeah.
Beads were never there before.
Well, it wasn't there in the forms that we see them. We don't know what wasn't there before, so we have to work with what we have rather than speculating that this is the first manifestation. But there's no doubt about it that, you know, working with and understanding materials, language, nature of social relationships, all of those things, you know, may have converged to produce a certain kind of material culture at certain times. Yeah. I think there's, do you have one over there? You have one over here? I don't know. What do you other archaeologists think?
You want me to say?
Give this.
I have to say that Meg and I have known each other for 52 years. Since we were graduate students together. I mean, I find it wonderfully fascinating. And the idea of changing a medium is much older than we thought.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely correct. Not just the beads from Bloempas, right? The use of ochre there. In my sites in Sinai, I have ochre being used at 50,000 years ago for all kinds of things, but never for painting. Never for painting, but still for...
That's preserved.
Yeah, that's in my little area, that's all.
Yeah.
Right. But the idea of portraying something on a wall, whether it's a hand, whether it's an image, whether it's a scratch, is something that is, as you say, universal. We even have it in Wisconsin. Okay? Seriously, Native Americans painted in caves in Wisconsin, somewhere around 1000 BC. So the idea of portrayal or of manipulating the environment, in effect, the material aspect of environment, is much older, and I think it does begin most likely with modern humans, maybe 175, 200,000 years ago. Although Namagoran in Israel claims, and if you go to Israel, you go to the Israel Museum, you'll see a little figure from a site called Birket Kunetra that's 250,000 years ago during the Acheulean period, and it looks like, I was with her when they found it, it looks like a human, but it's a very stylized show. The question is it carved or is it natural?
Right. Yeah.
All right? So they're now starting, finally, with new microscopes, et cetera, to look to see if they can find any scratch marks on these things, right? Otherwise, it's just there saying this is the earliest art.
Right. And we're great at reading into things.
Oh, absolutely. We're anthropologists.
And I think that's what they were doing also. You know, when they walk into the caves and they see these shapes, and they've got all of this visual, really powerful imagery from their daily lives in their heads. You know, you look and you see this shape and you go, oh, there's a horse there, right? I mean, we know from Inuit, for example, when you ask them whether that's a beautiful bear you made, they say, I didn't make a bear. There was a bear in the material. I was just bringing it out, right?
As Francois Bourg said, it's in the mind of the maker.
Right, another question.
Hi, I just wondered if there was possibly a connection between the rise of agriculture and the sudden stop of the art that was happening at the same time at 10,000 years, unless maybe agriculture hadn't reached that area by 10,000.
No.
No connection?
No connection, right. And you know, the notion that there is this sudden rise of agriculture. Look, these Paleolithic people, they knew plants. They collected plants. They made mats out of baskets. They did weaving, all those decorations on those female figurines I didn't show you because you all know them already. Those are all woven, snoods, things like that. They have little straps and little bandeaus on them. They're all woven. These people knew they had to have known their plants. How in the world are they going to get by, right? So the thought that somebody sort of one day got up and said, agriculture and it'll start here and we've got it and we're going to spread it around the world, you know, that's just crazy, right? Anything else? One more over here.
I was curious about when watching the presentation and the videos was the case of sort of the animal favoritism. What you see on the walls, it's like very much a lot of megafauna and like lions and very large animals. Right. And I was just at the Field Museum today, and I know that they collect thousands of insects and beetles and small things.
Right.
So I was wondering, is it just because, do they just draw things, or do you usually see things that are connected to their food web, or is it, do you ever see like an insect or an invertebrate, anything like that?
Well, we were just talking about that. Our hostess, one of our hostesses here is got her Ph.D. studying crickets. And I said, if I had only known, I would have showed the picture from the cave site on Lens in France of a cricket. There are some insects, grasshoppers, other kinds of insects, but they're relatively rare. And the bestiary, if you will, and you know, we call it a bestiary because these are animals that were selected for image making for their symbolic reasons, not necessarily because there's no real correlation between the food refuse and what's on the wall. So it's definitely, I think we've leaned much more to animals are good to think rather than animals are good to eat. Now, it might be, and I say this about one of my favorite sites that has no cave art in it, a site called La Vache, which is right across a gorge from a very famous painted cave site, Neo, that you can one can visit. And La Vache has occupation debris. It has an amazing repertoire of engraved and carved animals, very amazing animals on them and so forth. But these people had, and lots of the images on those carvings are bison. In the food refuse, you know, they're not eating bison. They're eating ibex, which are mountain goat kind of thing. They have ibex in their stomach, but bison on the mind, you know. And I think that's, and it's not just even distribution of animals. It's very clear that horse and bison are the preferred ones. Early on in Chauvet, we see some of the so-called, you know, dangerous animals, the lions, the rhinos. Those actually drop out of the repertoire. You don't see very many of them lately, whether they drop out of the myths, whether they drop out of the environment, or both. At the same time, you know, of course, we don't know. But both in southern France and Chauvet, we see the lions, and in the southwestern Germany, in the Swabian area, we also see the same sort of emphasis on some of the bear, lion kinds of things that then we don't see very much of before. So there is something to the counting of all of these things, and that's one thing that Laurent Guérin showed with his structuralist analysis, was that it wasn't just any old animal. You know, it's bison and horse, right? And whether they go together or what that's all about, but that certainly seems to be the persistent, preferred animals, right? Anybody else? Thank you.